Clement the Seventh became pope with the highest expectations in decades, but his indecision destroyed Rome and lost England forever. No historian can fully explain why a brilliant advisor became a paralyzed leader. 11 years separate his election from his death. In those 11 years, two catastrophes changed Christianity permanently. The sack of Rome in 1527 killed 30,000 people, half the city's population. The loss of England in 1534 created a new church that exists today. Both disasters came from the same flaw, his inability to choose a side. He was an illegitimate orphan. His father, Giuliano de' Medici, was murdered 1 month before his birth in the Pazzi conspiracy. His mother died within a year. He grew up knowing he existed because of violence. As Cardinal Giulio de' Medici, everyone called him the most capable diplomat in Rome, wise, calculating, trusted by two popes. And yet, as Pope Clement the Seventh, he couldn't make a single decisive choice for 11 years. This documentary examines 3 interpretations of his paralysis: the letters between Clement and Emperor Charles V, the contradictory accounts of his imprisonment in Castel Sant'Angelo, the recently discovered 1530 petition from English nobles hidden inside a chair for 2 centuries, the story of the Pope who saw both sides of every argument and lost everything because of it. Rome, the Vatican. May 6, 1527. Dawn. Smoke rose over the Tiber. Screams filled the streets. 20,000 soldiers were entering the city. Pope Clement the Seventh ran through a secret corridor. Behind him, the Swiss Guard were dying. But before that morning, Giulio de' Medici was just an orphan, a boy who survived because his uncle showed mercy. May 6, 1527. The sun had not yet risen completely over Rome. Pope Clement the Seventh woke to the sound of distant screams. From his window in the Vatican Palace, he could see smoke rising from the Borgo neighborhood, black columns against the pale morning sky. His secretary entered without knocking. "Your Holiness, the imperial troops have breached the walls. They are slaughtering everyone. The Swiss Guard are forming a defensive line." Clement stood frozen. How many soldiers? 20,000, perhaps more. Germans, Spaniards, Italians. All unpaid for months, all hungry. The Pope had been warned this would happen. For weeks, imperial commanders sent messages: "Pay our men or we cannot control them." Clement had responded with diplomatic letters, negotiations, promises of future payments, never a decision. Now the decision had been made for him. The imperial army had marched south through Italy like a plague. Their commander, Charles of Bourbon, had promised them Rome, the richest city in Christendom, churches filled with gold, cardinals with overflowing treasuries, and a pope who had betrayed Emperor Charles V. That betrayal had been Diane Clement. 2 years earlier, he allied with France against the emperor. Then he wavered. Then he tried to make peace. Then he formed the League of Cognac with France again. Each move weaker than the last, each promise more hollow. Charles of Bourbon died in the first assault, struck by an arquebus ball as he climbed a siege ladder. But his death only made things worse. Without a commander, the army became a mob. 20,000 armed men with no one to stop them. They poured through the Porta Santo Spirito. The Swiss Guard, 189 men, formed a line in St. Peter's Square. Behind them, the Pope was running. Cardinal Pompeo Colonna grabbed Clement's arm. "Your Holiness, the Passetto, the secret corridor. It is our only chance." The Passetto di Borgo, a covered walkway connecting the Vatican to Castel Sant'Angelo. Built centuries earlier for exactly this purpose, to save popes from invading armies, Clement hesitated. "If I abandon the Vatican, what message does that send?" "If I stay, you die," Colonna replied. "We all die." In the square below, the Swiss Guard were fighting. 189 against thousands. They held the line for 20 minutes, long enough for the Pope to decide. Clement ran. The Passetto was narrow, dark. Footsteps echoed against stone walls. Behind them, the sounds of battle grew louder. Steel on steel, screams, then silence as the Swiss Guard were overwhelmed. 147 Swiss guards died that morning. 42 survived by fleeing through side streets. Their sacrifice bought the Pope 15 minutes. Clement reached Castel Sant'Angelo as the first imperial soldiers entered the Vatican palace. The massive bronze door slammed shut. Inside, the Pope collapsed against a wall, still wearing his ceremonial robes, still holding nothing but his life. Outside, Rome began to die. The sack of Rome lasted 8 months, not 8 days, 8 months. Imperial soldiers moved systematically through every neighborhood. They killed priests in their churches. They raped nuns in convents. They tortured cardinals for the locations of hidden treasures. They stabled horses in St. Peter's Basilica. They used illuminated manuscripts as bedding for their animals. Contemporary accounts describe streets covered with corpses, so many bodies that burial was impossible. A plague broke out in July. It killed thousands more. The population of Rome before the sack was 55,000 people. By February of 1528, when the imperial army finally withdrew, only 10,000 remained. 30,000 dead. 15,000 fled and never returned. This was not a battle, this was annihilation. Inside Castel Sant'Angelo, Clement waited. The fortress had supplies, water from its own well, grain stored in underground chambers, papal guards who remained loyal, but it had no army, no way to break the siege, and increasingly, no hope. The emperor's representatives came to negotiate. They brought terms, harsh terms. Pope Clement the Seventh would pay 400,000 ducats in ransom. He would surrender Parma, Piacenza, and Modena to the empire. He would remain prisoner until the money was paid. Clement signed everything. On June 6, 1527, exactly 1 month after the sack began, he agreed to all imperial demands. But the emperor's men were lying. Even after signing, Clement remained imprisoned. The 400,000 ducats bought nothing. The imperial soldiers controlled Rome, and they were not leaving without extracting everything of value. For 6 months, the Pope lived in Castel Sant'Angelo, 6 months watching his city burn. 6 months knowing this catastrophe came from his own indecision. He had tried to play both sides. Alliance with France to counter imperial power, then secret negotiations with the emperor when France seemed weak, then back to France when the emperor seemed too strong. Each oscillation weaker, each betrayal more obvious. Now both sides hated him. France considered him a traitor, the emperor considered him an obstacle, and Rome paid the price for papal politics. In November, disguised as a merchant, Clement finally escaped. He bribed imperial guards. He walked out through Castel Sant'Angelo's postern gate, wearing common clothes. He fled to Orvieto, then Viterbo. He did not return to Rome until October of 1528. 16 months after the sack began. When he finally entered the Vatican again, he found it gutted. Rooms stripped bare, frescoes damaged, libraries scattered. The Renaissance glory of Rome had ended in blood and fire. And the Pope who caused it wore a full beard, a sign of mourning, a visible symbol of shame that he would never remove. If this story captivated you as much as it did me, hit the like button and subscribe. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Florence, April 26, 1478, Sunday morning. The bells of Florence Cathedral rang for High Mass. Families filled the pews. Sunlight streamed through the dome designed by Brunelleschi. It should have been a peaceful morning. Giuliano de' Medici walked down the central aisle, 24 years old, handsome, unmarried, brother of Lorenzo the Magnificent, the unofficial ruler of Florence. Everyone in the cathedral turned to watch him pass. He never saw the knives. The Pazzi family had planned the assassination for months. They hated the Medici, hated their power, hated their control of Florence's banks and politics. So, they decided to kill both brothers during Mass. In front of God and the entire city, Francesco de' Pazzi struck first. He stabbed Giuliano in the chest, then in the back, then in the throat. 19 wounds in total. Giuliano collapsed on the marble floor. Blood pooled around the altar. Lorenzo escaped, wounded but alive. He ran to the sacristy and barred the door. His supporters killed the conspirators within hours. They hanged them from the windows of the Palazzo Vecchio. They left the bodies swinging for days. But Giuliano was already dead. His body lay in the cathedral for 3 hours before anyone dared move it. The priest had fled. The congregation had scattered. Only the blood remained, staining the marble. 1 month later, a woman gave birth to his son. Her name was Fioretta Gorini, or perhaps Antonietta. The records disagree. Daughter of a professor, unmarried. Giuliano's mistress, though they had never formally wed. She named the baby Giulio di Giuliano de' Medici. Son of a murdered man, born into a family at war, illegitimate in a world where legitimacy meant everything. Fioretta died within a year. Some say childbirth complications, others say plague. The truth disappeared with her. Giulio became a double orphan before he could walk. Fatherless, motherless, existing only because violence had arrived 1 month too late. His uncle Lorenzo took him in, not out of love, out of duty. The Medici protected their blood, even illegitimate blood. Even the children of murdered younger brothers. For 7 years, Giulio lived with his godfather, Antonio da Sangallo the Elder, an architect, a practical man who built fortresses, not palaces, who understood that walls needed to be thick and doors needed to be strong. Giulio learned to be quiet, to watch, to never draw attention. Orphans in Renaissance Florence survived by becoming invisible. Then, when he turned 7, Lorenzo the Magnificent brought him to the Palazzo Medici. "You are family," Lorenzo told him. "You will be raised with my sons. Giovanni Piero Giuliano the Younger, named for his murdered father." Giulio studied alongside them. The humanists Lorenzo hired taught Greek, Latin, philosophy, music. They trained these boys to rule Florence, to navigate the dangerous world of Italian politics. But Giulio always knew he was different. Giovanni and Piero were legitimate, born to Lorenzo's wife, Clarice Orsini. They would inherit power. Giulio would inherit nothing. He wanted the church. From childhood he wanted to be a priest, to rise through the ecclesiastical ranks, to matter in a world where illegitimate sons did not matter. But canon law was clear: bastards could not hold high church positions. Not archbishop, not cardinal, certainly not pope. The stain of illegitimate birth was permanent, indelible. Proof of sin that no amount of piety could erase. Lorenzo found a different path. If Giulio could not be a priest, he would be a soldier. Lorenzo enrolled him in the Knights of Rhodes, made him Grand Prior of Capua, gave him a military career instead of a religious one. Giulio obeyed. What choice did an orphan have? But he never stopped wanting what he could not have. 1492, Lorenzo the Magnificent died, 43 years old. His eldest son, Piero, became head of the family. Giulio was 14, still illegitimate, still powerless, still hoping. 2 years later, the French invaded Italy. King Charles VIII marched his army through Tuscany. Piero the Unfortunate, as he would be called, panicked. He surrendered Florentine fortresses without a fight. He gave the French everything they demanded. The citizens of Florence revolted. They expelled the Medici, all of them. Piero, Giovanni, Giuliano the Younger, and Giulio, the illegitimate nephew who had lived on the family's charity his entire life. Exile. At 16 years old, Giulio became a refugee. He had no money, no position, no future, just a famous last name that was now worthless outside Florence. For 6 years he wandered Europe with his cousins. They were arrested twice, once in Ulm, once in Rouen. Each time Piero bribed their way to freedom. Each time Giulio remained quiet, watching, learning that survival meant reading which way power would shift before it shifted. They returned to Italy in 1500. The Medici tried multiple times to retake Florence by force. They failed. They tried diplomacy. They failed. They tried bribes. They failed. Then, in 1512, everything changed. Pope Julius II needed allies against France. He made a deal with Spain. Spanish troops would help restore the Medici to Florence. In exchange, the Medici would support papal policies. Giulio was 34 years old. He had spent half his life in exile. Now suddenly Spanish soldiers were fighting to put his family back in power. He rode with the army, not as a commander, as an observer, as someone who understood that loyalty to whoever won was how orphans survived. The Medici returned to Florence in September 1512. Giulio returned with them, still illegitimate, still unmarked by any great achievement, but no longer invisible. 6 months later, his cousin Giovanni became Pope, Pope Leo X, elected March 11th, 1513, 37 years old, the first Medici Pope. Giulio was standing in the crowd when white smoke appeared over the Sistine Chapel. He was 35 years old, an illegitimate orphan who had survived murder, exile, and obscurity. Everything was about to change. Within 3 months, Pope Leo declared Giulio's parents had been secretly betrothed. A legal fiction, a canonical loophole. But it worked. Suddenly, after 35 years, Giulio was legitimate. On September 23, 1513, Leo made him a cardinal, Cardinal Giulio de' Medici. The orphan born from murder was now one heartbeat away from the papacy itself. Rome, December 1st, 1521. Evening. Pope Leo X collapsed during dinner. He was 45 years old, healthy that morning, dead by midnight. Some said it was malaria, others whispered poison. The truth died with him. What mattered was the power vacuum. The Medici Pope was gone, and Cardinal Giulio de' Medici, his closest advisor for 8 years, suddenly had no protector. The conclave to choose the next pope began 2 weeks later. 39 cardinals entered the Sistine Chapel. They locked the doors behind them. Everyone expected Giulio to win. He controlled the largest voting bloc. 20 cardinals either owed him favors or feared Medici power. In any normal conclave, that would have been enough. But this was not a normal conclave. This was revenge. Cardinal Francesco Soderini hated the Medici. His family had ruled Florence before the Medici returned. Giulio had helped destroy them. Now Soderini saw his chance. He formed a coalition of French cardinals, angry nobles, and personal enemies. Their goal was simple: stop Giulio de' Medici at any cost. The first ballot came back divided. Giulio had 20 votes. Not enough. He needed 2/3, 26 votes minimum. The second ballot. Still 20 votes. The third ballot. The fourth. Days passed. The cardinals slept on straw mattresses in the chapel. They ate bread and watered wine. They grew tired, angry, desperate, but neither side would yield. On the 7th day, Giulio made a decision that would define his entire life. He withdrew his own name. The other cardinals stared at him in shock. "You are withdrawing?" "Yes," Giulio said quietly. "I am unworthy of such high office. Instead, I propose Cardinal Adrian Boëens, a holy man, a scholar, someone who can unite us." It was brilliant political theatre. Giulio appeared humble, selfless, concerned only with the Church's welfare. Surely the other cardinals would reject this unknown Dutch scholar. Surely they would then turn to Giulio as the obvious compromise. They did not reject Adrian Boëens. They elected him. White smoke appeared on January 9th, 1522. The new pope took the name Adrian VI, the only Dutch pope in history. A man who spoke barely any Italian, who had never set foot in Rome before his election. Giulio had miscalculated catastrophically. His attempt at strategic humility had backfired. Instead of becoming pope, he had made someone else pope. But Giulio was nothing if not adaptable. Within weeks, he became Adrian's most trusted advisor. The new pope spoke no Italian, knew nothing of Roman politics, understood nothing of the complex web of alliances that kept the papal states functioning. Giulio understood all of it. He had spent 8 years as Leo's vice-chancellor. He knew which cardinals could be bought, which ambassadors could be trusted, which Italian princes were plotting rebellion. Adrian needed him, desperately. So Giulio waited. He advised. He smiled. He never mentioned his own ambitions. And when Adrian spoke of church reform, of ending corruption, of challenging the powerful families who treated the papacy as personal property, Giulio nodded and agreed. 18 months later, Adrian VI died. Some said fever. Others said he was poisoned by Romans who hated his reform efforts. The graffiti appeared the next morning on his doctor's house. to the liberator of the fatherland. Rome had rejected the reform pope. Now they wanted someone who understood how power really worked. The conclave of 1523 began November 1st, 35 cardinals this time, fewer than before, but the same divisions. Cardinal Soderini was still there, still organizing opposition, still determined to stop Giulio. The French cardinals still remembered how Leo and Giulio had betrayed France multiple times. The reformers still whispered that Giulio represented everything corrupt about the Renaissance papacy. The first ballot. Giulio received 18 votes, not enough. The second ballot, 19 votes, still short of the 24 needed for two-thirds majority. Days passed, the cardinals argued, they negotiated, they prayed. Outside Rome waited. Inside the Sistine Chapel, beneath Michelangelo's ceiling, the future of the church hung in balance. On November 19th, something shifted. Cardinal Pompeo Colonna, who had opposed Giulio for years, suddenly changed sides. He went to the French cardinals. He made them an offer. "Support Giulio now," Colonna said, "and he will support French interests as pope. Oppose him, and the Spanish cardinals will elect someone far worse for France." It was a lie. Giulio had promised nothing, but Colonna was convincing, and the French cardinals were exhausted. They had been locked in the chapel for 18 days. They wanted to go home. The ballot that afternoon reached the threshold. 26 votes. Enough. White smoke appeared at sunset. The crowd in St. Peter's Square erupted in celebration. The balcony doors opened. The cardinal deacon stepped forward. "Annuncio vobis gaudium magnum, habemus papam." "I announce to you great joy. We have a pope." The orphan born from murder had won. Giulio de' Medici took the name Clement the Seventh, a deliberate choice. The first Pope Clement had been martyred. The second through sixth had been reformers or scholars. Giulio wanted that legacy, wanted to be remembered as someone who brought order from chaos. He was 45 years old. He had been a cardinal for 10 years, vice-chancellor under 2 popes, governor of Florence, advisor to the most powerful family in Italy. Everyone said he was the most qualified man to become pope in decades. Brilliant mind, diplomatic experience, deep understanding of both church politics and secular power. The expectations were enormous. After the disaster of Adrian's brief reform papacy, Rome wanted stability. After Luther's challenge in Germany, the church needed strong leadership. After years of war between France and Spain, Italy needed a pope who could keep the peace. Clement the Seventh would fail at all of it. But on November 19th, 1523, no one knew that yet. On that evening, as the bells of Rome rang and the crowd celebrated, Giulio stood in the papal apartments. He wore the white robes he had wanted since childhood. The orphan had become the father. The illegitimate son had become the supreme authority. The boy whose father was murdered before his birth now commanded armies and crowned emperors. Everything was possible. Everything was within reach. He just had to make the right decisions. Clement the Seventh became pope facing an impossible choice. 2 emperors wanted his loyalty, both had armies, both demanded total allegiance, and neither accepted compromise. To the west, King Francis I of France. Young, ambitious, he controlled Milan and much of northern Italy. He wanted the Pope to bless French dominance, to crown him protector of the Church, to ensure papal policy served French interests. To the east, Emperor Charles V, ruler of Spain, ruler of the Holy Roman Empire, ruler of the Netherlands and Austria and half of Germany, the most powerful man in Europe. He also wanted papal blessing, also demanded loyalty, also threatened war if denied. Between them stood Clement, and between them he tried to stand neutral. His first year went well. Clement signed treaties with both sides. He promised Charles support against Lutheran heresy in Germany. He promised Francis support against imperial expansion in Italy. He sent ambassadors to both courts with identical messages. The Pope loves peace. The Pope wants unity. The Pope serves all Christians equally. Both emperors nodded and smiled. Both waited to see which way Clement would actually move when forced to choose. The crisis came in 1524. Francis invaded Italy with a massive army, 40,000 men, the largest French force to cross the Alps in decades. Their target was Milan, controlled by imperial forces. Clement panicked. A French-dominated Italy meant the Pope would become a French puppet. He quietly sent messages to Charles. "Please send reinforcements. Please stop the French. I will support you." Then, weeks later, when the French army seemed unstoppable, Clement sent different messages to Francis. "I want peace. I will mediate. I support neither side." Both emperors received their spies' reports. Both realized Clement was lying to everyone. February 24, 1525. The Battle of Pavia. Imperial forces crushed the French army, destroyed it completely. 10,000 French soldiers died, 8,000 were captured, and King Francis himself was taken prisoner, captured on the battlefield, humiliated, defeated. Charles V now controlled all of northern Italy. His armies could march to Rome in weeks. The balance of power had collapsed. Clement immediately switched sides. He signed a formal alliance with Charles in April. The Pope promised to support imperial policy, to name imperial candidates as cardinals, to oppose French interests throughout Italy. Francis, imprisoned in Madrid, learned of the Pope's betrayal. He never forgot it. 14 months later, Francis was released. Charles demanded a massive ransom and territorial concessions. Francis signed everything. He promised to give up his claims to Milan, to marry Charles's sister, to send his own sons as hostages, guaranteeing the treaty. Then, the moment he crossed back into France, Francis renounced everything. He declared the treaty invalid because it was signed under duress. He began raising another army, and he sent ambassadors to Rome with a simple question: will the Pope honor his word to the emperor, or does the Pope remember who his real friends are? Clement froze. If he supported Charles, France would invade Italy again. If he supported Francis, Charles would destroy him. Either choice meant war. Either choice meant choosing sides permanently. So he chose neither. He formed the League of Cognac in May 1526, an alliance of Italian states supposedly dedicated to Italian independence from all foreign powers, including the French, including the Spanish. In reality, it was an alliance with France against Charles. Everyone knew it. Charles certainly knew it. The emperor's response was immediate. He ordered his commanders in northern Italy to prepare for war. 20,000 troops began marching south. Their destination was Rome. Clement received the reports. He sent diplomatic letters. "Your Majesty, I seek only peace. Your Majesty, I have no quarrel with the empire. Your Majesty, surely we can negotiate." Charles sent one letter back. "You betrayed me. You allied with my enemies. Now you will pay the price." The imperial army continued south, through Lombardy, through Tuscany, toward Rome. Their commander, Charles of Bourbon, promised his unpaid soldiers one thing: "When we reach Rome, you can take whatever you want." Clement still did not prepare defenses. He believed Charles was bluffing. He believed negotiation would work. He believed somehow he could talk his way out of the disaster he had created. On May 6, 1527, the imperial army arrived at Rome's walls. Clement finally understood he had run out of time. After the sack, after 6 months imprisoned in Castel Sant'Angelo, after escaping in disguise, Clement made his final choice. He surrendered completely to Charles. The Treaty of Barcelona in June 1529 formalized it. Clement agreed to crown Charles as Holy Roman Emperor, agreed to support imperial policy, agreed to oppose France, agreed to install Medici family members as rulers of Florence using Spanish troops. In return, Charles allowed Clement to remain Pope. That was the deal. Total submission in exchange for survival. On February 24, 1530, Clement placed the imperial crown on Charles's head in Bologna, the last time a pope would ever crown an emperor. Clement knelt before the man whose army had destroyed Rome. He performed the ceremony. He blessed Charles as the defender of Christendom, and he hated every moment of it. But the consequences were only beginning. Because Clement's subservience to Charles cost him something far more valuable than dignity. It cost him England. King Henry VIII wanted an annulment. He wanted to divorce Catherine of Aragon. She had not produced a male heir. Henry believed his marriage was cursed. He wanted to marry Anne Boleyn. He needed papal approval. Under normal circumstances, Clement might have granted it. Popes had annulled royal marriages before. Political necessity often outweighed canonical precision. Henry was powerful. England was important. Compromise was possible. But Catherine of Aragon was Charles V's aunt, his beloved aunt, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, a princess of the greatest Catholic dynasty in Europe. Charles sent word to Rome. If you annul Henry's marriage, you insult my family. If you insult my family, I will destroy you. Clement was trapped again. Grant the annulment and Charles would invade. Refuse the annulment and Henry would break with Rome. Either way, the Church would lose. So Clement did what he always did. He delayed. He formed a commission to study the matter. He promised Henry a favorable outcome. He promised Charles a careful review. He wrote diplomatic letters to both saying exactly what each wanted to hear. He delayed for 6 years. At first, Henry believed Clement would eventually approve. The Pope's letters were encouraging. The commission seemed favorable. Surely Rome understood England's importance. But as months became years, Henry's patience ended. His advisers began suggesting alternatives. Archbishop Cranmer said the Archbishop of Canterbury could annul the marriage without papal approval. Thomas Cromwell said Parliament could declare the Pope had no authority in England. Henry listened and waited. And when Clement still refused to decide, Henry stopped waiting. In 1533, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer declared Henry's marriage to Catherine invalid. Henry married Anne Boleyn. The Pope excommunicated them both. Henry's response came in 1534, the Act of Supremacy. Parliament declared the King of England was the supreme head of the Church in England, not the Pope, not Rome, the King. England broke away. An entire nation, 5 million Christians, gone from the Catholic Church forever, not because of theological disagreement, not because of Luther's arguments, but because a pope was too afraid to decide. Clement learned of the Act of Supremacy in November 1534. He had been pope for 11 years. In those 11 years, he had lost Rome to the sack, lost independence to Charles, lost Germany to Luther, and now lost England to Henry. 2 months later, Clement the Seventh died, 56 years old, worn out, broken. His beard still full and grey, the sign of mourning he had worn since the sack. But the mystery remained. Why? Why could he never choose? Why did a man famous for brilliant advice become paralyzed when the choice was his own? 3 interpretations exist. 3 ways to understand the Pope who destroyed everything by deciding nothing. The mystery without answer. The archives are full of Clement's letters. Thousands of them. Diplomatic correspondence, instructions to nuncios, replies to kings and emperors, all carefully preserved in the Vatican Apostolic Archives. They reveal a pattern. Every major decision delayed, every alliance provisional, every promise conditional. Clement wrote brilliantly about both sides of every question. He analyzed problems with extraordinary clarity. But he almost never concluded with a definitive action. When Charles demanded loyalty, Clement wrote that he understood imperial concerns. When Francis demanded loyalty, Clement wrote that he valued French friendship. When Henry demanded an annulment, Clement wrote that he would study the matter carefully. He wrote thousands of words explaining why he could not yet decide, almost no words explaining what he had decided. Why? Interpretation. 1. The realist. Perhaps there was no indecision at all. Perhaps Clement saw the situation more clearly than anyone else. Perhaps what looked like paralysis was actually cold calculation. Consider the facts. In 1523, when Clement became pope, Europe was locked in an impossible stalemate. Charles V controlled Spain, Germany, Austria, and the Netherlands. Francis controlled France and northern Italy. Neither could destroy the other. Neither would accept peace, and Italy, caught between them, would be the battleground forever. Any pope who chose one side would be crushed by the other. Any pope who declared neutrality would be ignored by both. The only rational strategy was to oscillate, to give each side hope without giving either side certainty, to survive by never fully committing. Diplomatic documents support this view. Clement's letters show he understood exactly what he was doing. In 1524 he wrote to his nephew in Florence explaining his strategy. We must appear to favor both emperors equally. The moment we choose, we die. From this perspective, the sack of Rome was not Clement's failure. It was Charles's brutality. The loss of England was not Clement's weakness. It was Henry's impatience. Clement played the only game possible. He lost because the game was unwinnable, but this interpretation has problems. If Clement was so calculating, why did he form the League of Cognac? That was not oscillation, that was choosing France. That was the decision that provoked the sack. And if Clement understood Henry's desperation, why delay 6 years? A calculating pope would have granted the annulment immediately or refused immediately. 6 years of delay served no strategic purpose. It only guaranteed England's loss. Perhaps Clement was not a realist, perhaps he was something else. Interpretation 2. The traumatized orphan. Perhaps the answer lies not in politics, but in psychology. Perhaps a boy who lost both parents before he could remember them, who survived only by being invisible, who learned that decisive action brought violence, could never overcome his childhood terror of choosing wrong. Consider Clement's pattern throughout his entire life. Before becoming pope, he was brilliant as an advisor. Everyone praised his analysis, his insight, his ability to see all sides of complex problems. Pope Leo X relied on him completely. But advisors do not make final decisions. Advisors present options. Popes choose. As long as Giulio de' Medici could analyze without concluding, he excelled. The moment he had to actually choose as Pope Clement, he froze. This pattern fits a specific psychological profile. The orphan who survives by never drawing attention, never making enemies, never committing to anything that might later be used against him, always keeping options open, always preparing an escape route. The Pazzi conspiracy was not just his father's death. It was the proof that decisive action led to knives in a cathedral, that choosing sides meant blood on marble floors. Giulio never witnessed the murder, but he lived his entire life in its shadow. From this perspective, every oscillation makes sense. Choosing France meant betraying Charles. Choosing Charles meant betraying Francis. Either choice meant blood, so he chose neither, not out of strategy, out of terror. This interpretation explains even the small details, why Clement grew a beard after the sack and never shaved it. Not just mourning, shame, visible, permanent shame, the kind of shame a traumatized person inflicts on themselves. Why Clement favored Alessandro de' Medici so extravagantly. If Alessandro was really Giulio's illegitimate son, then Clement was repeating his own father's pattern, creating another illegitimate child, another orphan waiting to happen. Desperate to give that child what he himself never had: security, legitimacy, power. Why Clement commissioned Michelangelo to paint the Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel, the final judgment, the moment when all indecision ends, when Christ divides humanity permanently into saved and damned. No middle ground, no oscillation, just eternal consequence. Perhaps Clement understood exactly what he was, and hated it. But this interpretation also has limits. Trauma does not excuse causing the deaths of 30,000 Romans. Psychology does not explain losing England. And even traumatized people sometimes make decisions. Clement made plenty of small decisions efficiently. He administered Florence well. He commissioned great art. He managed Vatican finances. It was only the huge, empire-defining choices that paralyzed him. Perhaps trauma was part of the answer, but perhaps not all of it. Interpretation 3. The Philosopher King. Perhaps Clement's problem was too much intelligence. Perhaps he saw every argument so clearly that he could not favor one over another. Perhaps genuine philosophical humility prevented him from imposing his will when multiple paths seemed equally valid. This sounds absurd, Popes are supposed to be decisive, but consider Clement's education. He was raised by Lorenzo the Magnificent alongside humanist scholars. He studied philosophy, rhetoric, the art of seeing multiple perspectives. Renaissance humanism taught that truth was complex, that ancient wisdom came from many sources, that certainty was often the mark of ignorance. The best minds could hold contradictory ideas in tension, could see merit in opposing arguments, could resist premature closure. Clement brought that training to the papacy, and it destroyed him. When Charles demanded loyalty, Clement genuinely saw the argument for imperial order. When Francis demanded loyalty, Clement genuinely saw the argument for French balance against imperial domination. Both positions had merit. Both had historical precedent. Both served certain definitions of church interest. A simple pope would have chosen instinctively. Clement understood too much to choose at all. Evidence for this view exists in Clement's patronage. He commissioned works from Michelangelo, Raphael, Cellini, and dozens of other artists. He approved Copernicus's heliocentric theory in 1533, almost a century before Galileo's trial. He supported theological diversity within limits. He was not a reactionary, not a simple authoritarian. He genuinely valued multiple perspectives, multiple forms of truth, multiple ways of being Catholic. That philosophical openness served the Church well in matters of art and science. In matters of politics and war, it was catastrophic. From this perspective, Clement was a great mind born into the wrong century. He needed peace to flourish. He got war. He needed time to deliberate. He got ultimatums. He needed nuance. He got emperors who demanded binary loyalty. The Renaissance was ending. The age of confessional warfare was beginning. Clement understood the Renaissance. He did not understand the future. So which interpretation is correct? Was Clement a calculating realist, a traumatized orphan, a philosopher overwhelmed by his own insight? The archives do not say. The contemporaries who knew him disagree. Francesco Guicciardini, who served Clement as governor of the Romagna, wrote that he had marvelous knowledge but lacked resolution, a description that fits all three interpretations. What we know for certain is the cost. 30,000 dead in Rome. England lost. Protestant Reformation strengthened. Catholic Church diminished. The papal authority Clement inherited was vast. The authority he bequeathed to his successor was broken, and Clement knew it. In his final months, dying of liver failure, he dictated letters apologizing to cardinals, to rulers, to God himself. Not for bad decisions, for no decisions, for choosing indecision when the Church needed clarity. He died September 25th, 1534, 56 years old. He left instructions that his tomb should be simple. No grand monument, no celebration of papal glory. Just his name, his dates, and silence. The mystery remains unsolved. Perhaps it will always remain unsolved. Perhaps the human mind is too complex to reduce to a single explanation. Perhaps Clement was all three interpretations at once, calculating and traumatized and philosophical. A brilliant man, destroyed by his own brilliance. Or perhaps there is a fourth interpretation no one has yet imagined, hidden in documents not yet discovered, waiting in archives not yet opened. The only certainty is this: Clement the Seventh could analyze any problem with extraordinary clarity. But when the moment came to act on that analysis, something inside him broke. And that breaking changed history. History remembers popes. History forgets the people who died for papal indecision. Rome remembers. Walk through the Borgo neighborhood today. The buildings date from after 1527. Everything older was destroyed. The churches were rebuilt, the houses reconstructed, the streets repaved over ashes and bones. 30,000 people died in 8 months. Most have no names, no monuments, no record beyond the mass graves outside the city walls. But some names survived. Some stories remain. 3 people whose lives intersected with Clement's choices. 3 ordinary people who paid extraordinary prices. Marco Antonio Colonna, 22 years old, Swiss guard. He enrolled in the Pontifical Swiss Guard in January 1527, 4 months before the sack. His family came from the canton of Uri in Switzerland. Mountain people, poor but proud. The Swiss Guard paid well, better than farming, better than mercenary work with uncertain employers, and it offered something rare: legitimacy, honor. The chance to protect the Holy Father himself. Marco trained in St. Peter's Square, how to hold formation, how to use the halberd, how to die rather than retreat. The oath was clear: I swear to faithfully, loyally, and honorably serve the Supreme Pontiff and his legitimate successors. I pledge to sacrifice my life to defend them. On May 6, 1527, at dawn, Marco stood in that square, facing 20,000 soldiers, 189 Swiss Guards total. 147 stayed in formation, 42 fled. Marco stayed. He was 22 years old. He had been a guard for 4 months. Imperial soldiers killed him on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica. His body was stripped of armor and thrown into the Tiber. His family in Uri learned of his death 3 months later. They received no body, no compensation, no papal gratitude, just a letter saying he died bravely, doing his duty, protecting a pope who had created the disaster through indecision. Elisabetta di Giorgio, 34 years old, servant in a cardinal's household. She worked for Cardinal Lorenzo Pucci, cooking, cleaning, managing the household staff in his palazzo near the Pantheon. She had worked there for 8 years, raised 2 daughters there. Her husband had died of fever in 1523. The cardinal's household was her security. When the imperial army entered Rome, Cardinal Pucci fled. He escaped through a servant's entrance, took his valuables, took his secretary, left Elisabetta and the other servants to face the soldiers alone. The palazzo was looted on May 7th. Spanish troops broke down the doors. They took everything of value: silverware, tapestries, furniture, wine from the cellars. Then they found the servants hiding in the kitchen. The soldiers raped Elisabetta and killed her. Her daughters, aged 9 and 12, disappeared, probably taken as slaves. Possibly killed. The records do not say. Cardinal Pucci returned to Rome in March 1528. He found his palazzo gutted. He hired new servants. He requested compensation from the Pope for his losses. He received 3,000 ducats. No one compensated Elisabetta's daughters. No one even recorded whether they survived. Thomas Cranmer, 37 years old, scholar from England. He was not in Rome during the sack. He was not Italian. He did not die. But Clement's indecision destroyed his world just as thoroughly. Thomas Cranmer believed in the Catholic Church, ordained as a priest, brilliant theologian, teaching at Cambridge University when King Henry summoned him in 1529. The king wants an annulment, they told him. The Pope refuses to decide. We need scholars to build a case. Will you help? Cranmer agreed, not because he doubted the Pope's authority, because he believed canon law supported Henry's position. Catherine's previous marriage to Henry's brother created an impediment. Pope Julius II's dispensation was questionable. Leviticus forbade such unions. The arguments were solid. Cranmer went to Rome in 1530 as part of Henry's delegation. He met with papal officials. He presented the canonical arguments. He believed he was serving both his king and his church. That Pope Clement would eventually see reason and grant the annulment. That everything would resolve peacefully. He was wrong. Clement delayed, then delayed again, then delayed more. Cranmer watched the Pope's indecision gradually poison Henry's faith in Rome, watched English bishops begin questioning papal authority, watched Parliament start discussing independence. In 1533, Henry made Cranmer Archbishop of Canterbury. Cranmer still believed in reconciliation. He thought if he granted the annulment locally, the Pope would eventually accept it. That Clement would compromise rather than lose England. He was wrong again. Cranmer declared Henry's marriage to Catherine invalid in May 1533. The Pope excommunicated him. Suddenly, Thomas Cranmer was outside the Catholic Church, cut off from the institution he had served his entire life. Declared a heretic for doing what he believed was canonically justified, he lived another 23 years, long enough to see England become fully Protestant. Long enough to write the Book of Common Prayer that still defines Anglican worship, long enough to be burned at the stake by Queen Mary when Catholics briefly returned to power. At his execution in 1556, Cranmer thrust his right hand into the flames first, the hand that signed the annulment, the hand that broke with Rome because a pope could not decide. 3 people, 1 soldier, 1 servant, 1 scholar, all destroyed by decisions Clement never made. History books discuss the sack of Rome as a political event. They analyze the League of Cognac as diplomatic failure. They debate whether Clement should have granted Henry's annulment based on canonical precedent. But Marco died on steps. Elisabetta died in a kitchen. Cranmer burned in a square. Not because of theology, not because of politics, because one man could not choose. How many others? How many names lost? How many families destroyed? How many people whose lives would have been completely different if Clement had decided anything, chosen anyone, committed to any path with finality? The archives do not count them. They count only popes and emperors and treaties. They preserve diplomatic letters. They catalogue indecision. They explain why choosing was difficult, but they do not name the dead. We began with smoke rising over the city. A pope running through a secret corridor. 20,000 soldiers destroying everything he had tried to protect. Now we understand what that smoke meant. Not just the end of Renaissance Rome, not just a military disaster, but the consequence of a specific human flaw, the inability to choose. Clement the Seventh saw every side of every argument. He understood France and Spain. He grasped Henry's desperation and Charles's power. He analyzed brilliantly. He decided nothing. And so 30,000 Romans died. England left. The Protestant Reformation grew stronger. The Catholic Church entered a century of religious war, all because one brilliant man could not make one final choice. The archives in Rome still preserve his letters. Thousands of pages explaining why he could not yet decide, almost nothing explaining what he decided. History asks a simple question. Was indecision a flaw, or was the situation truly impossible? Could any pope have navigated between 2 emperors and survived? Perhaps you can answer what Clement could not. When the choice is terrible, is choosing worse than not choosing at all?